Dear Lord in heaven, thank you for this day that we've been blessed to receive. Thank you for the opportunities that we have to come together. Thank you for the blessing of technology that we can meet, though we're miles apart. We ask that you'll guide us and direct us as we continue our studies this morning. Bless us to understand the messages that you have given to us as we repeat and enlarge upon studies that have been presented. We ask for your Spirit, that you will continue to pour out your rain upon us, that we may learn and grow, that our faith and our practice may be in accordance with the character of God, that we may reflect your image to your glory. We ask this for all of our members around the world, those who are in the Sabbath hours now and shortly to come. We ask for a special blessing upon our elders and our leaders, that they may guide and direct us, and a special encouragement for all members to continue the work that we have done in uplifting each other, that we may continue to share the messages and grow in understanding and knowledge, that our faith and works are right before you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So good morning, everyone. Today we are going to be in a similar route to Jacoby from earlier, looking at a study that Elder Tess presented back in 2020. And I've continued to look at this series of studies that she's presented, and still trying to get my head around it and understand and grasp it properly. So back in 2020, Elder Tess was teaching a series of studies showing the nature of Waymarks, in particular relation to the history of Concord in our time as priests back then in 2020. So I'll draw it up on the board so that we can maybe even refresh our memories as to what was shown. So behind me here, we have a small part of the line of the priests, P up there for priests, and we had our 2019, our close of probation, and we had these Waymarks, and we had the year 2021, which was our second Advent. So back in 2020, we were in this position when Elder Tess was giving this message, and she had been going through the events that had taken place up until this point and what was coming. So taking us through the reform line of the priests. And we know that through other reform lines, we can overlay certain structures on top of this. We get the structure of Boston, Concord, and Exeter through the Millerite history. So Boston, Concord, Exeter, followed by a shut door. And we get that structure from, as I said, the Millerite history. Particularly, you'll see it in July 21st. You see August 1st, August 12th to the 15th, and then you'll see the shut door October 22nd. This is all through 1844. So what we're seeing is a structure that is used in multiple reform lines being laid over a history. We take that structure here that was used in the Millerite reform line and we apply it over the top of this. But what we understand is that information changes from the events and circumstances that took place here. They change to what we're seeing, or what we did see back during this history here. We also understand from the beginning of our movement, we use slightly different words. If you have a look at the beginning of the 144,000. We had the start of the reform line, 1989. It was called the increase of knowledge, the formalization. So we had different words to describe a similar pattern that was seen in the writings of Ellen White and the events that took place through this part of the history in the Millerites. So we see this repeating pattern understood using different terms. So increase of knowledge and formalization. We're seeing these same symbols used and repeated and overlaid on different reform lines. And another example where we see Ellen White use this repeating pattern is in the Great Controversy. She represents it as I think it's called God's People Delivered is the chapter. And we see that the close of probation has come. Shortly after, as you continue reading through the chapter, you see the death decree arise, followed by time being given. So the saints that are there, according to the Great Controversy, are given the idea of time and how long until Jesus returns. And then when Jesus returns, that's it. That's the last example given. So we're using these continual structures and overlaying them on top of each other to understand the stories that we're seeing playing throughout our reform lines. So when we compare these fractals with each other, what are we able to see? If we were to look at August the 1st, so this is a question for you, for everyone who's participating. What happened on August the 1st? Can we recall? August the 1st in 1844. It was just a camp meeting, right? So it was a single day, it was a single event. And this represented concord in this history. If we were to go to the line of the 144,000, which is the increase in knowledge at 1991, does anyone recall what the event was and how long did that event take? So there are lots of different events that can take place in 1991. So the point that I'd like to bring out is that when we're comparing these histories with Concord, we're seeing that depending on the history that we're looking at, the structure is very clean and simple and overlays on top of each other. But as we go through the history, especially for us here now at the end of the world, our increasing knowledge, our formalization, or our Concord and Exeter waymarks are packed with information and usually spread out over a long period of time. And so why is that important for us? Why is it important for us to be able to see the events that are taking place or that took place back here in 2020 during this period. We were standing here as Elder Tess was presenting, and we were looking back at the events that took place at Concord in our line, the line of the priest, which has now since ended. The reason why it was so important for us is, if we look over to the right-hand side of the board, we have the line of the 144,000 up the top. The line of the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. This picture that we're looking at here, this 2019 to 2021, is a fractal or a small piece of this year. This is the history that we are looking at from Elder Tess's study from 2020. And what's so important about the study is to understand that the events that were taking place around us during this history were the same events that were taking place for the 144,000, for the line of the Nethinims, and for the world. So the people within the church, within this movement, the people within Adventism, and anyone without any faith or any being a part of any other denomination or belief, all had an understanding of events that were taking place during this period. And based on the information that we were receiving, they were making a decision one way or another as to which side they would stand on. These two dates here, 2019 and 2021. These happen to be the increase in knowledge and the formalization for the 144,000. So the information that we received during this period in time was this increase in knowledge and the formalization prior to the Sunday law being given. We understand it's not a literal Sunday law, but it's a placeholder that we're using, a name that describes a particular waymark. So I'll share a quote with you. It's a familiar quote. You've seen it a lot before. It's from early writings. It's from Ellen White's First Vision. And we're going to see, we'll read this out. Soon we heard the voice of God like many waters, which gave us the day and hour of Jesus coming. So if we're looking up on the board where we saw this, we saw the time was given here. The living saints, 144,000 in number, knew and understood the voice, while the wicked thought it was a thunder and an earthquake. When God spoke the time, he poured upon us the Holy Ghost, and our faces began to light up and shine with the glory of God, as Moses did when he came down from Mount Sinai. So we'll stop sharing there for the moment. So what we want to notice there is that Ellen White is comparing the history of Moses on Mount Sinai and comparing it with the 144,000 after the close of probation, when they receive a message on time. When they receive this message, this formalization of a message, their faces light up. And the reason that their faces light up is compared with Moses on Mount Sinai. So when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, it was because he had seen the glory of God. He understood in some part the glory of God, the character of God. And so we're seeing here that in this time period, 144,000, not a literal number, also understand and comprehend as Moses did, like Moses did, similar to Moses did, the character of God. When we look at that over here, in this history, we see that this is also a formalization. Each of these marks are formalizations. And we're understanding that we understand better the character of God through the messages that we receive. So this study that was done by Elder Tess in 2020 is designed, we're looking at it today in a way to identify the complexity of history, to understand that we're given simple structures, repeatedly different structures and simple structures to overlay onto a complicated history to help us be anchored and centered in the information that we're given as we wade through the complex histories. And as Jacoby mentioned earlier, we've been given a part of a verse of Daniel 40. And as we head into Daniel verse 41, the information is not going to slow down. The events and circumstances might change slightly. We're going to be held to a higher expectation. Like in school, we start at early learning. We progress up to, at least in Australia, kinder, then primary school, then secondary school, and then to university. And each time you progress through these schools, more is required and expected of you to be able to pass the exams that are given of your courses. We're also going to look at the cause and the effect of the events right through our reform line. So we'll look at the reform line of, say, the 144,000, take a look at the events that took place and gain a healthier understanding of the complexity of those events that happened and the dates that we put on them. So we understand that prior to 2019, that God was giving us messages through messengers, was doing a continual work for us. And we understand that while God is doing continual work, Satan is also doing a continual work in his work. It appears through different portions of history that one power seems to be restrained. We understand that God is limited in what God is able to do for us. We are unable to just have thoughts planted into our mind and just go and do those thoughts. We need to learn, we need to study and grow and grasp a concept before we can action these things that come into our mind. And so Satan and God both have the same restriction. They're restricted by us as humans as to how far and we can advance in a particular generation or through a particular history. So we came to a time of trouble in this period down here that's written in the Great Controversy. Well, we as a world will come to this point. And through this history, there has been restraint prior to this point. And then it's written that there is an unloosing. And that unloosing, or the restraint that is withheld, is give an example of a death decree. So the two powers or forces that are working, we have God working for his team here on earth, and Satan working for the appropriate team here on Earth. And so we're seeing these armies mobilize, not literal armies. We're seeing the battles taking place. We're seeing them projected all over our phones, all over our internet feeds, the news feeds, and being presented by people within the movement. It's the understanding of the events that are taking place around us and how these two proxies are being used. So at November 9 in 2019, up here in this reform line, we saw the fires begin to take place here in Australia, and we saw in November 17th was about the earliest time we saw the first case of the pandemic in China, which I can't think of its name now, coronavirus. So the very first cases of coronavirus are recorded within China in early November. And we had our fires here in Australia. Why that's important is previous to 2019, we had received a midnight cry message. And depending on how far you want to take that back, 2016 to 2018, we're saying we are given, the people within this movement are given the studies and the information to show that there's two streams of information, and that depending on which stream you take, you are going to end up on the wrong side of history and prophecy, or on the right side. So prior to COVID, we have all the resources required. We have the Zoom all set up. We have all the technology is ready. And then when a pandemic hits, we are able to grow and adapt through those set of circumstances. The world also went through exactly the same situation. People outside of this movement, people who are in the Adventist Church, and those who are of any other denomination or of no faith, atheists, as we've been seeing through the Vespers programs on Friday nights, are confronted and faced with the same information. And we are learning and growing in this handling the information that we're receiving and understanding where these different parties and different groups are coming from, what their aim is, what their goals are, as they mobilize for this final war, to end this war. So as a result of COVID, we saw that conspiracy theories rushed in everywhere because of these two streams of information, people being locked at home, access to the internet, and having no work to go to predominantly. We were bombarded with information, that information being good or bad, depending on where you were searching on the internet. So we don't understand the Waymarks as well as we can through our reform lines. And we need to understand them and the relevant history that follows along with those external events that take place around us, so that we can bring the appropriate change within ourselves, and understand the topics that are being presented out in the world and how to correctly identify them and position ourselves. So as we focus our attention on a waymark, we understand that it needs to be marked by a singular event for simplification. But we also know that to have the best understanding of that waymark, we need to have a comprehensive understanding of the events and the reasons that led to that flashpoint. So up here on the board, we will look at, if we take the Millerite history, for example, there was a set of circumstances that led to different meetings being organized and different people getting up and giving sermons and instructions on a date down here in the end. And when we go back through history, we're able to see what happened with the methodology, how it went wrong, why it went wrong. And so we're doing the same with our history as we're going through it now, as it happens before us. Elder Tess, when she's presenting this presentation, is here in the year 2020, looking back on the events that took place at this time at what we call Concord, understanding better. And as we apply this, as we continue to move forward, we have Boston, Concord, Exeter, followed by a test or a shut door, where we're seeing the information of the events that played out through this history have an impact from this Sunday law and moving forward, where people are making their decisions on where they'll stand eternally. So we're going to go back through some of the waymarks that we see on the line of the 144,000 and probably the line of the priests, actually, and see what are the dates that we mark, why do we mark them like this, and what were the events surrounding those dates, because nothing happens by itself. The saying that we use is, and nothing happens it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just happen by itself. So there was a set of cause and effect relationship that led to a event taking place. And we'll start with a simple line, the line of the priests. And the first one we'll start at is 1989. I will share screen with you and we'll look at what is it that we mark in 1989. Is anyone able to give me the date that we mark for 1989?
November 9.
November 9.
Thank you.
And September 11 as well.
November 9. So I'll share screen with you and we will look at we're going to do some reading here and look at some of the events that took place. We mark the fall of the Berlin Wall, but there was a set of circumstances that led to that fall. So this is from, you can see the references given at the bottom of each quote there. 30 years ago, Hungary lifted restrictions on travel to Austria, enabling tens of thousands of East Germans to flee to the West. The September 1989 events in Hungary are often described as the first cracks in the Berlin Wall. So prior to November 9 of 1989, we have two events take place. We have the first cracks being seen in the events that took place at Hungary in September. So September 11 of 1989. We'll read down the next quote. When the end finally came for the Iron Curtain, it was not bulldozers or hammers that struck one of the first decisive blows, but a picnic. 30 years ago this Monday, on August the 19th, 1989, thousands of Hungarians and Austrians gathered at the border fence between two countries, which also marked the dividing line between the communist bloc and the West. They had come for a pan-European picnic. So if you're Googling this, you type in pan-European picnic, and it will bring up the events and the circumstances that took place. They'd come for solidarity and friendship across the Iron Curtain. As momentum for political change increased and the Eastern Bloc regime struggled to keep up with the rising popular discontent. They were joined by hundreds of East Germans who took the opportunity to rush across the border into Austria and from there into West Germany. Hungarian border guards declined to shoot, and in the subsequent weeks, thousands more made the crossing. 3 months later, the Berlin Wall fell, and the path to the end of communism in Europe and the continent's unification were irreversible. So this article mentions a couple of points. It goes back to right back to August 1989. It mentions there's this event. Then it also, we read earlier, September 11, there is a cracks made in the wall, and followed by the date that we understand or know as 1989, November 9, where we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what we're understanding is that we mark 1989 for simplicity on our reform lines, because we can't fit all this information in. And depending on the story that you're telling will depend on the information that you're putting into that story. But what we also want to see is the complexity of the history, that there is a cause and effect relationship that goes well back before this date, that we saw all through the Cold War, leading up to its fall and demise of the USSR during 1989 and through to 1991. The Hungarian government of the time, which had taken steps to start dismantling parts of the border fence several months earlier, gave official blessing to the picnic, and thousands of Austrians came across the border to join the Hungarians for an afternoon of music and speeches. Pliers were handed out and people set about dismantling the fence, which not long before had been electrified. So this is not something you would ever thought of doing prior to these points in 1989. You would have been shot and killed. You would have been electrocuted by touching the fence. It was not a nice place to be. This person recalls that I had an uncle who escaped in 1956, and most of us knew the terrible things that had happened on the border. So it was very exciting to cut down the Iron Curtain. So we're seeing, prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the cutting down of the Iron Curtain that we're seeing, and a photo here that's taken place on September 11. The organisers insist that they had not banked on the arrival of hundreds of East Germans who were allowed to holiday in Hungary but not to travel to the West. Still, tipped off by West German diplomats in the country, several hundred travelled to Sopron and burst through the border gate and into Austria. The guards on duty decided not to shoot, and although the border crossing was resealed a day later, the tide had turned. Overcoming worries of how Moscow would react, Hungary's government opened the border properly on the 11th of September and tens of thousands of East Germans passed through. So what we're identifying there is mainly those dates and the events that surrounded those dates to understand that it is complex. We are able to see it, and we're able to see it more clearly when we overlay simple structures and to be able to teach it and understand it better using these structures that we're given. These repeating patterns. So now we're going to jump forward. We'll have a look. We've had a look at 1989. We're going to jump forward to 2001 and take a look at the events that took place in 2001. For everyone out there who's participating, what were the events that took place in 2001?
Yes, Graeme, the collapse of the Twin Towers.
Yes. And what happened there? The collapse of the Twin Towers. What do we call that within the movement?
9/11.
9/11.
9/11. Yep, that's a title that we give to it. What else do we say happened here?
We had 11/9 as well in 2001. Was that the fall
Yep.
of Mazar Sharif?
That's the one. Yes.
Okay.
So there's often within the movement we can say, I'll say incorrectly, or we'll put it too simply, as we will say it is the restraint of radical Islam. But when we say that, we're saying a very simplistic and incorrect title to an event that happened later. So we'll continue reading on with a quote that we've got here. We know that the date is 2001 and 9/11. And what we're seeing is that in 2001, at September 11, there was a plane attack by a group of radical extremists who bombed using planes the Twin Towers in America. So in 2001, on that date, there can't be a restraint of this radical sect of Islam because they've made this attack. So the restraint must come later. We understand that shortly after the attack, America sent soldiers into Afghanistan to assist, and we're going to read a couple of articles that point out what took place. Afghanistan's Northern Alliance troops yesterday finally got what they had been requesting: the bombing of Taliban front lines outside of Kabul by the United States military forces. Such attacks should clear the way for an advance on the Afghan capital. But fighting north of Kabul is not the major offensive in Afghanistan at the moment. To the northwest of Kabul, the battle for control of the largest city in northern Afghanistan, Mazar-e-Sharif, is the area of the fiercest fighting and the key to resupply of the Northern Alliance. So prior to this battle taking place at Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan, reporters are noting that this is the key point for the Taliban, for this sect of radical Islam that is within Afghanistan, who have a foothold or a stronghold here. And by taking out this attack or taking out this area, this is allowing the Allied forces a great opportunity to advance strongly in the war on this terror, this form of terror. So they know this prior to this attack taking place. The bombing campaign, which began on October 7, first destroyed Taliban's air force, consisting of about 20 Soviet-era fighters and some aging helicopters. Without air capability, the Taliban's ability to resupply its forces was disrupted. Striking ammunition depots robbed the Taliban of some of its arsenal, and attacking vehicle convoys from armoured carriers to pickup trucks severely limited the Taliban soldiers' freedom of movement. So without these tools, they couldn't fire their as many rounds of ammunition or guns or bombs, and they couldn't transport troops from one place to another, which limited their ability to fight. The turning point was the Battle of the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif, where US Special Forces operatives on the ground selected the bombing targets and directed the strikes. The fall of Mazar-Sharif on November 9 broke the Taliban aura of invincibility. It sapped their morale and started a domino effect of defections by regional commanders and provincial warlords. So we understand in, stop sharing for a moment. We understand up here on the board that on September 11th, a group of radical Islam attacked the USA, bombed the towers using their planes, and this was our cause relationship. The effect of this was on November 9, that same year, 2001, the Allied forces of America and Afghanistan and other countries worked together to demoralize and attack the Taliban in Afghanistan, and this was the turning point for the war on that form of terror. So what we're seeing is a cause and effect relationship between these two waymarks that we've looked at. When we trace this back, we understand that even at this level, this is a very simple understanding, and that we can see Afghanistan, the USA, radical Islam previous to these histories, but we're understanding the effects within this period of time here. So we understand that a waymark can be marked by a singular date, because that helps for simplicity, but we also understand that there are a set of circumstances that take place through this history that give full meaning to that date. So I'll continue sharing screen with you again. A more limited bombing campaign was then unleashed on Taliban positions here, and those attacks continued until the Taliban's last day in the capital, when US helicopters fired missiles at the Taliban members fleeing the city in pickup trucks. The basic equation of the war, said a US Air Force officer, was 21st century air and space power combined with 16th century land forces. So we see coming together there of two different types of forces to defeat the enemy. So we're going to move on to another date now. One that we mark simply and then fail to grasp, or sometimes don't understand the complexity of the issues that were taking place during this time. So we're looking at 2016. And we're seeing particularly with the election, we're seeing a cause and effect relationship in the election process, and we understand that Donald Trump is elected to power. We identify November 9 with the election. But then we also understand that it isn't until December 19 that Donald Trump fully wins the election by gaining the electoral vote. We see a cause and effect relationship. We'll have a look at 2018 for a moment. So what we're doing is we're leading down to this history here, 2020 Concord, because there was a set of incidents or a set of circumstances that took place in 2020 that makes up the whole of this waymark. It's not a singular point by itself. And we're just giving some examples of how this has worked previous to this particular waymark. A lot of this information you'll already know and you'll have seen in the presentations. It's just repeating and understanding what has taken place. So we're going to start sharing the screen again, and we're going to run through a list of events that took place. The battle, what we would call the Battle of Heraclea. So this is from 21st of September through to 19th of December, where Donald Trump orders the full withdrawal of troops from Syria. We're seeing Donald Trump picking a fight with Vladimir Putin and the response and the cause and effect of that. So on April 21st, we're just going to run through some of these dates. They're given in a news article, and just have a look at some key dates and what happens during these key dates. And Volodymyr Zelensky is elected president of Ukraine, and soon after, allies of President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, relay a message that Giuliani wants to meet with him. Mr. Zelensky puts him off, noting that he has not yet taken office. So April 21st, Trump and his lawyers are reaching out to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. May 6th, the State Department announces that Marie Yovanovitch, forgive me for my mispronunciation. I don't mean any disrespect. I have trouble with some of these pronunciations. The American ambassador to Ukraine has been called to Washington months ahead of the schedule after Giuliani and his allies spread unfounded allegations that she was disloyal to Trump about the same time that John Bolton, the White House National Security Advisor, warns Giuliani's a hand grenade who's going to blow everyone up. May 10, Giuliani tells Fox News that Zelensky seems surrounded by operatives allied with the Democratic Party and enemies of the president, and in some cases, enemies of the United States. A few days later, an associate of Giuliani's warns the Ukrainians that American aid could be withheld, according to the associate lawyer, although others dispute that timing. So we see here that the Giuliani is going to Fox News. We know Giuliani, we know Fox News. It's not good information, and starts fabricating information. And we're seeing here the understanding that Ukrainians may have been told that they were going to be withheld the aid that was allotted to them. On July 18th, in a secure conference call with national security officials, an Office of Management and Budget staff member announces that Trump was freezing $391 million in security aid to Ukraine until further notice, citing a presidential order to the budget office. So we see here that the money has been frozen. Ukraine now can't access that money. On July 25, so just a few days later, a week later, during a phone call with Zelensky, Trump raises the favors he is seeking, including a Biden-related inquiry. Afterwards, Mr. Vindman, one of the note takers, reports the call to Mr. Eisenberg. So you can't, as a leader of the country, you can't give a whole heap of money and then say, I want these favors done for me. That's not right. And that's why the person in the room, the note taker, reports the call to another person. On August 9, the Ukrainians have learned by this date that the military aid is frozen and they should speak with Mr. Mulvaney, who says, I think POTUS really wants the deliverable. Mr. Sondland texts. Mr. Sondland and Mr. Volker are working on a draft language for Zelensky's announcement of the investigation. And Mr. Zermak says the White House should nail down Zelensky's Oval Office invite first. So they're trying to incite this investigation into Biden's son. They're trying to stop what would soon become the next president of the USA, and trying to dig up dirt and cause as much trouble behind the scenes as possible. On August the 12th, the CIA officer detailed to the White House files a whistleblower complaint about the July 25 call and other concerns, and it begins its slow trek to Congress. So the CIA are made aware of the complaint and the issues, and they begin to take those issues and investigate. September 1 in Warsaw, Zelensky asks President Mike Pence about the military aid, and Pence says that only that he will speak to Trump. Mr. Sondland tells Mr. Yermak not to expect the money unless Zelensky publicly announces a Burisma investigation. Zelensky later prepares an announcement for the September 13 CNN appearance, which the Ukrainians hope will satisfy Mr. Trump. So Ukrainian as a country needs the money in order to fight this war and to protect themselves. Trump is withholding the money and is doing underhanded bad things that end up getting him in trouble. On September 9, news of the whistleblower report reaches the House Committee, so the House Committee within the United States. Sondland calls Trump, asking specifically what he wants from Ukraine. Trump replies nothing and insists there is no quid pro quo. So then he starts going back on what he's originally said. Trump, he realizes he's in trouble, realizes the CIA are investigating, and then starts being careful on his phone calls. On September 11, 2 days after the House Committee is notified of the whistleblower complaint and opens an investigation, the White House reverses course and releases its hold on the military aid. Plans for Zelensky's CNN interviewed are scuttled. So we're seeing again, September 11, the aid is released. So when we're marking particular waymarks, we've got 2018. We can't, as you've just seen through one example given by a competent news source, that there was a whole list of information and events and circumstances that took place in order to see the events that we saw at Heraclea. And if you remember, Heraclea is a literal fight that took place way back in ancient Greece. We saw there that, and as we see here, that Trump is losing this battle. The king of the north comes against the king of the south, and the king of the south wins. September 25, one day after Speaker Nancy Pelosi announces a formal impeachment inquiry, the White House releases a transcript of Trump's July 25 call with Zelensky. Trump and Zelensky held a joint news conference at the United Nations during the General Assembly session. The whistleblower complaint is delivered to Congress. November 13, the impeachment inquiry is scheduled to begin public hearings. So we're seeing these events taking place. I will stop sharing there for the moment. When you continue going through those events that take place, you get down to December 19. And Donald Trump loses this battle with the King of the South. So what we're seeing is cause and effect relationship. And as we noticed with particularly this event that took place in 2018, we're marking a cause with the aid being released, but there was a whole bunch of circumstances and events that took place prior to this cause happening, with the outcome being the effect that took place on December 19. Each of these are an example of the complexity of the waymarks that we have throughout just the reform line of what was known as the priests. We see an attack on American soil, and we see a retaliation as a result. We see a restraint of radical Islam once we get down to here, November 9, with the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif. We see the popular vote and the electoral vote resulting in the election of the president, at that point, Donald Trump. And we see in 2018, Donald Trump being antagonistic towards Vladimir Putin, and the effect that takes place. Vladimir Putin loses that, wins that fight against Donald Trump. 2019, we've got the date, but we're unsure of the story at this point in time. And we're looking at the internal struggle between America, because it's a battle between the Western Front and the Eastern Front. So as we continue to understand that story, I'm sure further studies will help to promote the instruction that we've been given there. So all of these dates help us to understand 2020 and to see the picture and the story that's being constructed. And then after that story is constructed, we can begin to understand the internal consequences and expectations upon us. So 2020 is a date that's given by the study of revolutions. And revolutions is another in-depth study, which is a study. A revolution is a fight for control of a government between two groups, between two factions. We're seeing that this is, in America, played out as Democrats versus Republicans. It isn't a simple, neat history, this 19-year history that we have from 2001 through to 2020. Looking at the stories of the revolutions. it's not a neat, simple history. We're seeing East and West, when we bring in World War II, collide with the election cycles that are taking place here. So we know that it's not all one party. Republicans and Democrats are switching here in office of power and the work that they're doing to cement their position for years to come. We understand that Barack Obama was elected during this period prior to Trump being elected. So we're seeing swings and changes in leadership between Republican Democrats until we get the overthrow of the Republican Party and the election of Donald Trump and the changes that we're seeing taking place. And by November 9 in 2019, we have a victorious Republican Party that's purged its party and we're seeing a rallying against that new system of government. So we have Biden elected and we see this war taking place, this counter-revolution. But we understand that the counter-revolution is not successful. So when we're looking at revolutions, the key revolution to lay over this period is the American Revolution. The British had been oppressing the colonies of America for years. This is in the early 1700s. And there's bloodshed, there's fights, there's massacres, but then there's a key battle that unifies the colonies of what would be known as America. And that shot around the world is what sparks that battle, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Somehow this set of circumstances is the tipping point or the turning point that allows for such an uprising and such a revolution against its oppressors. Concord unites the people with purpose and passion, and we're looking at the history of Concord and the events that are taking place here. So we're going to see events take place in this period that unite people with a sense of purpose and with a sense of passion to rise up in a counter-revolution against the ideas, the ideology of the Republican Party, understanding that it's not successful. So we're going to look at some different people here at the marking of Concord. We're going to look at the lives of a few different people and understand the role that they played throughout history, and look at their deaths and what their deaths have shown through this history and how it has impacted society as a result. So we're comparing the events and circumstances that took place back at the revolution in early America between America and Britain. We're seeing a shot heard around the world. There'd been lots of fighting previous to this shot, but for whatever reason, these circumstances sparked something within the people. We saw that in America with people of color being shot. They've been shot at a higher rate than white people have for many, many years. And one previous to George Floyd was Eric Garner. Eric Garner was a person of color who was shot dead by the police. And there was a little bit of an uprising, but it wasn't much. Then shortly after, we had George Floyd. And George Floyd, there was an officer who knelt on his neck for, I think it was about 8 or 9 minutes. And that caused his death. The recording of his death and sending it out throughout the world via social media, the news and everything, was a shockwave that went around the world, just like the shot heard around the world in the original revolution between America and England. So it sparked a counter-revolution. So we have a date that we mark on this, May 25. We mark it as the beginning of this battle, this counter-revolution. This counter-revolution is against the system of government that has been set up systematically by the Republican Party throughout the years previous to us now. And unfortunately, we know that it's not going to be successful, the counter-revolution, because we have a Sunday law shortly to come. So Biden is a centrist. He is elected to government, does some good things, does some bad things. The judicial branch is gone. What we mean by that is that it is firmly in the grasp of conservative-minded people who are always going to rule in a particular way. And as we've seen at the start of 2022 to present, there have been a whole heap of overturnings of rules and laws that have wound back gender equality to levels not seen for 60, 70 years. Biden also wants to spend money on the police, wants to keep funding them. We understand that's a bad thing because it's not addressing the systematic problem that we see throughout the police forces there. And the USA, as it's been known in the past, comes to an end at the Sunday law. The rules, as was taught today by Jacoby. So May 25 is the beginning of Concord, and it perfectly fulfills what was seen at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It triggers civil unrest in America to a scale that hadn't been seen since the assassination of Martin Luther King over 50 years ago. So we're looking at a different time period on the priest reform line that is a fractal of what Ellen White describes in the great controversy regarding the death decree. We marked it up here. This is Concord. This is 2020, May 25. And Ellen White uses this same simple structure and overlays that at this point, at the end of the world, there is a death decree. So we're seeing this repeating pattern emerging. But George Floyd wasn't the only person who was killed or died during that period. There were 4 other people who were represented different issues who passed away in that same period, in that same year. So we'll start to have a look at those people. So we know that the 4 people we're looking at particularly are George Floyd, John Lewis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Chadwick Boseman, we had Helen Reddy. So there were quite a group of people and what they represented and what they did with their lives and the impact that they had on society and the impact that it will have on society as a result of their deaths. Continued to pour an outcry and gain momentum and passion for this counter-revolution. So I'll share screen with you again. So we're just going to look at an Ellen White quote here. When the protection of human laws shall be withdrawn from those who honor the law of God, there will be in different lands a simultaneous movement for their destruction. As the time appointed in the decree draws near, the people will conspire to root out that hated sect. It will be determined to strike in one night a decisive blow which shall utterly silence the voice of dissent and reproof. So what we're noticing here is Ellen White is commenting on a piece of history that is to come for the 144,000 after the close of probation. In her visions, in her time period, there was to be a death decree, and that this death decree was to utterly silence dissent and reproof. And so what we're looking at here, when we've just lined up behind us on the board, the Concord with the death decree, we're seeing the silencing of dissent and reproof. And the first person we're going to look at is John Lewis. John Lewis, the world has lost a legend. The civil rights movement has lost an icon. The city of Atlanta has lost one of its most fearless leaders. And the Congressional Black Caucus has lost our longest serving member, the caucus said in a statement. The Congressional Black Caucus is known as the conscience of the Congress. John Lewis was known as the conscience of our caucus. A fighter for justice until the end, Mr. Lewis recently visited Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. His mere presence encouraged a new generation of activists to speak up and to speak out and get into good trouble, to continue bending the arc towards justice and freedom. So we're seeing a right up there after the death of John Lewis, to see his work and his service to the community, and then how he lived in a very brief statement. Because of the time, I'll stop there, and next time I can continue with the study of Concord. So hopefully out of this today, we begin to understand that waymarks can be so simple and deceptive in their dates that we put up the top, but behind the date there is a history filled with information, and depending on the history that we're wanting to bring out depends on the information that we want to unveil. And we see that we are given the tools and the opportunity to learn and study these things by the grace of God, by the technology that we have, by the effort that we put forward. So we'll close there in prayer. If you are able to, if you're near with me, or bow your heads. Dear Lord, thank you for the day that we've been blessed to receive. Thank you for the weather that we have here in Victoria. It's wonderful. Thank you for the blessings of the Sabbath. We ask that as we try and continue to wrap our heads around the complicated histories that we are wading through in the present, we ask for your grace, for your methodology, for a correct understanding of how to use your methodology to understand these waymarks, these events, and the effects that they're having on the people around us. We ask for insight and understanding as we read through these articles and continue to repeat the messages that have been given through the midnight cry, that we can learn of you. Please bless everyone that's here as we head through our Sabbath hours. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.